Welcome back. I've spent the past few days buried in change logs, mailing list threads, and security advisories, and honestly, this has been one of the messier stretches the Linux and open source world has had in a while. We've got a browser maker finally being transparent about where it's headed, a community repository that got turned into a malware delivery system, and a foundation that just watched its own community vote out the man at the center of a 2-year controversy. So let's not waste time. There's a lot to get through, and I want to give each of these the depth it actually deserves. Let's start with the story that's been quietly simmering for 2 years and finally boiled over this June, the GNOME Foundation. The GNOME Foundation held its 2026 board election, with voting instructions going out to eligible members on June 15th and results certified in the final days of the month. And the outcome sent a genuinely loud message. Robert McQueen, the foundation's longtime president, was not reelected. Sit with that for a second, because this is someone who's been a central figure in GNOME governance for years, and the community essentially said enough. So why now? It traces back to Sonny Piers, a former GNOME director who was removed from the board at a special meeting on May 17th, 2024. At the time, almost nothing was said publicly. The foundation issued a brief statement citing the board's bylaws and a code of conduct process, gave essentially zero specifics, and moved on. Piers was banned, later had that ban reduced to a 1-year suspension, and was automatically unbanned as that period lapsed. For most of that stretch, he stayed largely quiet. But this year, with McQueen running for re-election and community members openly raising questions about the 2024 removal on GNOME's own discussion forum, Piers decided to lay out his account directly in public on the record. What he described paints a picture of a foundation that was, in his telling, barely functioning behind the scenes during that period. According to Piers, invoices were going unpaid and contractors weren't getting paid for months. This, while the foundation had just received a roughly $1 million grant from the Sovereign Tech Fund, a moment when you'd expect financial operations to be airtight, not falling apart. He says he raised these issues repeatedly, was told they'd be addressed, found out later they hadn't been, and that when he tried to escalate the matter to the wider board, the relevant meeting got canceled. Shortly after, he was the one who ended up removed. He's also described being pushed toward a non-disparagement style agreement. In plain terms, a request to stay quiet, framed around protecting the foundation's reputation, while his own reputation absorbed the public hit in the silence that followed. McQueen's side, based on his own public responses in that same GNOME discussion thread, is that these were decisions made collectively across multiple boards and multiple executive directors, not his alone, and that this played out during an unusually difficult stretch for the foundation. He's acknowledged some things went wrong procedurally, but he hasn't directly refuted the core specifics Piers laid out, and that gap is really the heart of the issue. Nobody has flatly denied what Piers described. It's just sat for 2 years in a fog of vague statements and legal caution. Here's what makes this bigger than a personality conflict. Piers also pointed to a pattern beyond his own removal, the foundation's failure to renew that Sovereign Tech Fund grant, which instead went to KDE, and years of unfulfilled promises around adding payment support to FlatHub, something that's reportedly been discussed for close to 7 years without materializing. If even part of that holds up, it's not a single misstep, it's a pattern, and the GNOME membership clearly read it that way when the 2026 results came in. McQueen was out. The new board is now composed of Adrian Vovk, Deepa Venkatraman, Jonathan Blandford, Julian Sparber, and Sriram Ramakrishna. Several of these names will be familiar if you followed GNOME-OS development and the broader modernization effort happening under the hood over the past couple of years. Worth noting too, outgoing board president Alan Day, who'd only stepped into that role last year amid an earlier crisis involving the abrupt departure of a short-lived executive director, chose to withdraw from running again entirely rather than seek re-election himself, which tells you something about how draining this 2-year stretch has genuinely been for the people closest to it. There's real reason for cautious optimism here, though, and I want to give credit where it's due. Behind the scenes, there's solid evidence the foundation has been quietly getting its financial house in order over the past several months, independent of all this board drama. A formal credit card policy was implemented. A dedicated finance advisor was brought on. The budget was balanced with an actual stated commitment to keeping recurring revenue and recurring expenses aligned going forward rather than a one-time patch job. Financial reporting moved from quarterly to monthly, which is a meaningful transparency upgrade on its own, and accounts payable and receivable got automated. Worth remembering, since unpaid invoices and missed contractor payments were literally at the center of this entire dispute in the first place. So some of the underlying dysfunction is genuinely being addressed just very quietly, without much fanfare attached to it. But here's my honest read, and it's one I'd have said the moment this story first resurfaced. The core failure here was never really about whether Sonny Piers and Robert McQueen simply didn't get along, or whether GNOME hit a rough financial patch. Every organization hits rough patches. The actual failure was transparency, or the near total lack of it. When you remove an elected director, someone the community specifically voted in to represent them, you owe that community an actual explanation, not a two-sentence statement, not silence reinforced by a non-disparagement agreement. You don't need to air every private detail, but you need to give people enough to actually trust the process. GNOME didn't do that, and it cost the Foundation 2 years of internal conflict, real reputational damage, and now the ousting of its own sitting president. In the next section, I want to walk through why that reputational damage matters beyond just GNOME insiders, and then move into a story that's arguably more urgent if you're actually running Arch Linux on your machine right now, because unlike boardroom politics, this next one is about your system potentially being actively compromised as we speak. Before I move on from GNOME, it's worth being clear about why this matters, even if you've never once opened a GNOME discourse thread in your life. People conflate GNOME the foundation with GNOME the desktop environment, and they genuinely aren't the same thing. The desktop itself, but the actual software. Millions of people boot into every single day across Fedora, Ubuntu, Debian, and dozens of other distributions, is solid, and it's been getting real, substantive engineering attention lately. But when the headlines are all board, drama, and non-disparagement agreements, that reputational stink attaches itself to the whole project, fairly or not. The new board has a real opportunity here, and given the financial reforms already quietly underway, there's genuine reason to think they might take it. If they want to rebuild trust, actual radical transparency going forward isn't optional anymore. It's the bare minimum the community is going to expect after watching 2 years of this play out in public. Now let's shift to something that should genuinely make you stop and check your own system before you keep watching. If you're running Arch Linux or any Arch-based distro like Manjaro, EndeavourOS, or CachyOS, this is the AUR situation, and unlike the GNOME story, this one isn't about boardroom politics. It's about active compromise. Security researchers have dubbed this the Atomic Arch campaign, and it started making headlines on June 11, 2026, when the Arch Linux team and independent researchers disclosed a large-scale supply chain attack against the Arch user repository. Here's how it actually worked. It's genuinely clever in a way that should worry anyone who trusts a community package repository a little too blindly. The AUR has a feature called ownership transfer. If a package maintainer abandons a package and goes quiet, another user can request to adopt it. They inherit the package name, its build history, and critically, all the trust the community has built up around it over months or years. It's a great system for keeping useful software alive. It also turned out to be a fantastic attack vector for anyone patient enough to exploit it. Attackers systematically adopted orphaned AUR packages, ones with already established reputations, and instead of touching the actual software those packages installed, they left it completely alone. Instead, they modified the PKG build, the build script itself, quietly adding a post-install step that pulled down malicious NPM packages, including one called Atomic Lockfile and a related package called JS Digest. Because the visible software stayed untouched and the malicious payload was buried in a build instruction, almost nobody actually reads line by line. This slipped past community review for a while. What does the payload actually do once it lands on a machine? According to researchers who dissected it, including teams at Sonatype and TrueSec, it's a Rust-based infostealer built to harvest credentials and exfiltrate data, going after SSH keys, browser cookie databases, and data stores tied to apps like Discord, Slack, and Telegram. But here's the part that escalated the severity of the whole thing. If the payload lands with root privileges, it can optionally load an eBPF-based rootkit to hide itself, using pinned BPF maps that researchers found were literally labeled things like hidden PIDs and hidden names to conceal its own processes and network connections from standard monitoring tools. It's worth adding some nuance that got lost in a lot of the earliest coverage. This rootkit isn't used to gain elevated privileges in the first place. It only activates if the malware already has root and the right system capabilities, so this isn't some magic privilege escalation exploit. But once it does activate, cleanup gets far harder than simply uninstalling the offending package. A package manager can remove the files it installed. It cannot verify your system is actually clean after a rootkit-capable payload has had the chance to run and hide. The scale here has been a moving target. Initial disclosures on June 11th and 12th put the number at over 400 compromised packages. Within days, that climbed. By the weekend, Arch's own team and outside researchers had confirmed the figure had passed 2,900 affected AUR packages, spanning some genuinely widely used software categories: KDE Plasma applets, Firefox adjacent forks and extensions, and a chunk of Node.js-related tooling. Basically, anything sitting inside an actively maintained ecosystem became fair game. On June 14th, a second, more sophisticated wave of malicious activity was spotted, and the Arch team responded by disabling new account registration entirely while they worked through cleanup. A genuinely blunt but understandable move, given the scale of what they were dealing with. So what's actually being done about it? Arch has pushed updates to Yay, the most popular AUR helper, to give users more visibility before installing or updating anything. You can now see a package's last modification time directly in search results, so if something was edited yesterday and you're not sure why, that's your cue to hold off. There's also new support for configuration options that let you automatically exclude packages modified within a recent window, effectively building in a cooling off period before AUR updates reach your system. It won't stop a sufficiently patient attacker, but it widens the window for the community to catch something before it lands on your machine. It's also worth knowing this isn't the AUR's first brush with exactly this kind of trouble. In 2025, 3 separate AUR packages were caught distributing a remote access Trojan through similarly manipulated build scripts, and a separate incident that same year involved a re-uploaded browser package with a malicious Python one-liner buried in its build instructions. Both were caught and pulled within roughly 48 hours. But the pattern is now impossible to wave away as a one-off. It's a recurring weakness baked into how the AUR's adoption model fundamentally works. My honest take here, and I've said versions of this before, the AUR is a fantastic resource for grabbing that one obscure tool you can't find anywhere else, but it was never designed to be the backbone of your entire system. Community reviewed doesn't mean community verified in any meaningful security sense. If there's an officially packaged Flatpak, Snap, or properly vetted distro repo version of something available, that should be your default. Save the AUR for the genuinely niche stuff, and even then, check modification dates before you build anything on your machine right now. Not after you finish this video, right now. Seriously, pause here if you're on an Arch-based system and go look. Now let's shift gears to something that's actually good news, because this next story is genuinely the bright spot of the week. And it's a useful example of what it looks like when an organization responds to years of criticism by actually changing its behavior instead of digging in, which connects directly back to the trust problem we just spent the last 2 stories talking about. That's where we're headed next. Let's talk about Firefox, because after years of people, myself included, criticizing Mozilla for being cagey about its roadmap, it's genuinely good to see this level of transparency from them. On May 21st, 2026, Mozilla officially confirmed what had been rumored for a couple of months: Firefox's biggest visual and structural redesign since 2020, internally called Project Nova. And it's not just a coat of paint. Mozilla's own UX team described it in their announcement as a renewal, not a replacement, with the explicit goal of keeping Firefox competitive against Chromium-based browsers while doubling down on the things that actually differentiate it: privacy, customization, and user control. Visually, you're looking at softer, rounded tab shapes, updated iconography, and a warmer color palette that Mozilla says is inspired by Fire. That might sound like marketing language, but the more substantial part of this is what's happening underneath. Menus, panels, and controls are being standardized across desktop and mobile, so the experience feels consistent regardless of which device you're on. The settings menu is getting a full redesign specifically to make privacy controls easier to find and understand. Right now, a lot of Firefox's best privacy tooling is genuinely buried in submenus most users never touch. Under Nova, things like the built-in VPN, private browsing controls, and enhanced tracking protection all become more visible and front and center rather than hidden away. There's also a feature I think deserves real credit. As of Firefox 148, there's a dedicated AI controls panel in settings that lets you disable every AI feature in the browser at once, current and future, with a single master. Toggle. No restart required. In an era where basically every browser vendor is quietly building AI into every corner of their product, whether you asked for it or not, Chrome now running Gemini Nano at a fairly deep system level, Edge increasingly built around Copilot. Giving users one clean, honest kill switch is a meaningfully different approach. Mozilla's own language in the announcement was pointed about it, describing Firefox as still built for people rather than platforms. It signals an attempt to position Firefox as the genuinely privacy-respecting alternative rather than following the industry's default pattern of shipping AI features on, by default, and burying the opt-out 3 menus deep. Beyond the redesign itself, compact mode is finally making a comeback for users who want a denser, less padded interface, and Mozilla is expanding personalization options while putting real effort into accessibility improvements. As for timing, Nova is already testable in Firefox Nightly right now if you want to try it early, and Mozilla has said the broader rollout to all users will happen later in 2026, though they haven't committed to an exact date yet. Alongside the redesign, Mozilla's broader June roadmap update included several other details worth flagging. Tab groups have already shipped for Android, letting mobile users organize and color code related tabs the way desktop users have been able to for a while, with iOS support promised later this year. There's a new block tracker widget giving users a clearer visual sense of what's actually being blocked on any given page. On the more technical side, recent Firefox betas have added HDR video support for Windows and a built-in color picker, both things power users have wanted for a while. Interestingly, Mozilla also confirmed that true window transparency, something people had hoped would ship alongside Nova, is actually being delayed until after the initial launch. In the meantime, there are some Windows-specific tweaks using Mika theming that can approximate a blur effect if you're impatient, though it's not the real thing. Looking further down the roadmap, Mozilla is committing to bringing its built-in VPN to mobile versions of Firefox, redesigning the private browsing window so you can clear all data in a single click instead of closing and reopening a fresh session, and adding an ad and tracker blocker to Firefox on iOS by default, which actually puts it ahead of most mobile browsers, since ad blocking on iOS usually requires a separate app install even inside Safari. There's also passkey support coming to the integrated password manager, expanded fingerprinting protections, broader web API support, JPEG XL support, and better CSS compliance across the board. On performance, Mozilla is targeting faster page loads specifically. The company says it's already improved load times for key page content by roughly 9% over the past year, along with a new resource monitor for Firefox on Android, so you can actually see which tabs are eating your memory, plus a power-saving mode that automatically suspends resource-heavy tabs. Honestly, what stands out most to me isn't any single feature on this list. It's how restrained the AI section of the roadmap actually is. There are really only 2 AI-related items mentioned: the Smart Window feature, an optional AI browsing experience already available without a waitlist, and a feature called Quick Answers that lets you get concise responses to voice queries. That's it. In a browser market where every vendor seems desperate to cram generative AI into every toolbar and sidebar, whether it improves anything or not, Mozilla keeping its AI ambitions this narrow, while giving users a global kill switch on top of it, feels like a deliberate and genuinely smart positioning choice. I'd be doing you a disservice, though, if I didn't mention the less flattering context around all of this. Firefox's market share has continued sliding. StatCounter data shows its desktop share dropping from around 5.88% in May of last year to roughly 3.9% as of May 2026, a steep decline in just 12 months, while Chrome continues to dominate globally and Edge quietly picks up ground. There is one genuine bright spot worth mentioning. Mozilla has reported gaining several million users, specifically in EU markets following the rollout of mandatory browser choice screens under the EU's Digital Markets Act. So regulatory pressure in Europe is doing something Mozilla's own marketing hasn't managed at the same scale on its own. So here's my take. This roadmap is exactly the kind of communication I've been asking Mozilla for a long time. It's not a fully dated release schedule with quarters attached to every single feature. It's closer to a prioritized backlog. But that's still miles better than the vague hints and long silences we used to get. If Mozilla can actually execute on this list, particularly the AI kill switch, the mobile ad blocking on iOS, and the VPN expansion, Firefox has a real shot at clawing back some trust from privacy-conscious users who've drifted toward Chromium alternatives out of frustration rather than genuine preference. Good work here, genuinely. Now it's about follow-through. Let's zoom out, because when you put these 3 stories side by side, GNOME, the AUR, and Firefox, there's a common thread running through all of them, and it comes down to one word: trust. Every single one of these stories at its core is about whether the organizations and systems we depend on in this ecosystem are actually being honest with the people who rely on them. With GNOME, the issue was trust between a foundation and the community that elects its leadership. When Sonny Piers was removed back in May 2024, the foundation had every legal right to keep the details quiet, and their lawyers probably told them that factual silence was the safest path. But safest legally doesn't mean healthiest for the organization long term. 2 years of unresolved tension, a non-disparagement agreement, and vague public statements bled into a full-blown election crisis in 2026 that ended with the sitting president voted out and the acting president withdrawing from the race entirely rather than running again. The lesson here isn't subtle. When you're a community-governed nonprofit and your community elected the person you're removing, opacity doesn't protect you. It just delays the reckoning and makes it worse when it finally arrives. The genuinely good news, and it's easy to miss under all the drama, is that behind the scenes, GNOME's finances have actually been getting fixed. Balanced budgets, monthly reporting instead of quarterly, automated accounts payable so contractors don't go unpaid again. That's real, tangible progress. The new board just needs to pair that operational fix with the transparency fix, and GNOME could genuinely come out of this stronger than it went in. With the AUR, the trust question is more mechanical, but arguably more dangerous, because it's not primarily about reputation. It's about what's literally running on your machine right now if you're on an Arch-based system. The AUR's entire model depends on trusting that a package's history, and reputation still means something even after ownership changes hands. The Atomic Arch campaign exploited exactly that assumption, and it did it patiently, adopting orphaned packages and waiting rather than trying to brute force something obvious. That patience is what should worry you more than the raw number of affected packages. Over 1,500 compromised packages is bad on its own, but the methodology is the real threat, because it means this isn't a one-time bug that gets patched and forgotten. It's a structural weakness in how community package adoption works. And until the AUR changes that adoption process itself, more vetting, more cooling off periods, tighter scrutiny on ownership transfers, this kind of attack is going to keep happening. If you're running Arch or an Arch-based distro right now, go check your AUR package modification dates against the known affected lists today, not after you finish this video. And then there's Firefox. Honestly, the one clear bright spot in this whole roundup, and a good example of what happens when an organization actually listens to sustained criticism instead of digging in defensively. Mozilla took real heat for being cagey about its plans for years. Project Nova isn't perfect. There are no hard dates attached to most of the roadmap beyond later in 2026, and true window transparency already slipped past the initial launch window. But compare that to GNOME's handling of a genuine governance crisis, or the AUR's ongoing structural struggle with orphaned package security, and Mozilla's approach looks like the model worth following. Show your work, tell people what you're prioritizing and why, and let the community push back if they disagree. That's how you build trust, instead of slowly bleeding it out over years. Here's the bigger picture I keep coming back to with all three of these stories. Open source runs on trust in a way that proprietary software mostly doesn't have to deal with. When you use Windows or Mac OS, you're not electing a board. You're not adopting orphaned packages built by strangers. You're not waiting on a foundation to explain a personnel decision from 2 years ago. But that trade-off, more transparency, more community control, more actual say in the direction of the software you use every day, only works if the organizations on the other end genuinely honor it. GNOME is learning that lesson the hard way right now in public. The AUR is being forced to confront its structural weakness through an active, ongoing attack campaign. And Firefox, whatever you think of its declining market share, is at least trying to earn that trust back proactively instead of reactively, which is more than a lot of larger, better-funded competitors are currently bothering to do. So where does that leave things heading into the rest of 2026? I think GNOME's new board has a real opportunity here. And given the financial reforms already quietly underway before the election even happened, there's genuine reason for optimism if they choose radical transparency going forward instead of falling back into the same defensive posture that got the previous leadership voted out. I think the AUR needs actual structural changes to how orphaned packages get adopted, not just better after-the-fact tooling to spot problems once they're already spreading. And I think Mozilla deserves genuine credit for this roadmap. But they need to actually follow through and ship what's on it, because promises about mobile ad blocking and AI kill switches don't mean much until they're sitting in your hands, working, on a release date that actually holds. That's everything for this roundup. It's been a heavy one, honestly. A foundation crisis, an active malware campaign, and a browser trying to rebuild trust from the ground up, all inside the same few weeks. But this is exactly the kind of story I think matters more than most tech news cycles give it credit for, because it's not about a flashy product launch. It's about whether the software running your daily life is actually being handled honestly by the people behind it. If you found this useful, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss how these three stories develop from here. And drop a comment telling me which of these three you think matters most, and whether you've already gone and checked your own AUR package list today. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.